Hey guys, what's going on? It's Ben here. I am back again today doing another video, and the subject of our video today is going to be on the Minnesota Timberwolves between 1999 to 2006, which I'm going to call the Kevin Garnett era. Now, if you know much about Garnett's time in Minnesota, you'll know that he actually played there from 1995 to 2007. But I'm highlighting these 7 seasons in the middle of that chunk of time where I feel like the Timberwolves were a legitimate contender. Of course, this is chronicling the rise and fall of Garnett's Wolves in the continuation of the Rise and Fall series, where I examine how a contender came to be, how it peaked, plateaued, and then ultimately started declining. Doing this for various contenders throughout NBA history. If you haven't seen any of my other videos in the series, go check out the playlist. This is a part of it. Hope you guys enjoy this, and yeah, we're gonna get into it. So, picking up from the first season here, as you'll see up top, I have the team's record, how they fared in the playoffs, and then their offense and defensive rating. Below on the left side of each screen, you'll see regular season statistics, and on the right, you'll see playoff statistics. I've highlighted games played, minutes played per game, uh, field goal attempts and percentage, same with 3-pointers, same with free throws, then rebounds, assists, steals, blocks, points. And I started in 1999 for the Wolves because before this they had made a couple of playoff appearances, but they'd only been around a 500 team for each of those playoff appearances, so I feel like they weren't like legitimate contenders. But this 1999 to 2000 season was the first year where they had a pretty respectable record and actually were a contender in my opinion. So if you look at the breakout of this team, you got a pretty solid season from Garnett. The second option is Terrell Brandon. And then you've got some supporting pieces in Zerbiak, Malik Sealy, Joe Smith, Anthony Peeler. Those are probably your main 6 guys, you'd say. And then some ancillary pieces in Nesterovich, Sam Mitchell, and Bobby Jackson. And a pretty well balanced team at this point. Offense pretty high up there, and defense pretty decent. You know, you don't have any like signature defenders on this team outside of Garnett, but he is like a defensive player of the year caliber guy. And to me, offensively, you know, outside of Garnett, again, nobody outstanding. Terrell Brandon puts up a pretty good year here. I think a really big key to this particular team's success was just that basically everybody was healthy for the whole year, and they didn't suffer any major injuries. When you get to the playoffs, really, I think the reason this team had a downfall was that Portland was just a deeper team, and you know, Portland could boast Scottie Pippen, Steve Smith, Damon Stoudemire, Arvydas Sabonis, Rasheed Wallace. Off the bench, you had Stacey Augmon, Greg Anthony, Brian Grant, Jermaine O'Neal still. So you had just a very, very deep team. And just to be frank, the Timberwolves didn't really have nearly as much depth. And Garnett struggled actually quite a bit in the playoffs, getting guarded by Rasheed Wallace, surprisingly, who I don't always think of as a great defender, a good defender, but not a great defender. But he did a pretty good job of locking down Garnett. Outside of that, you had Wally Zerbiak fall off a little bit from 51% from the field to 40%. And overall, the Timberwolves had a lot of guys who were like good role players, but the thing with role players is they can go cold pretty easily, and a lot of the Wolves guys did that between Wally Zerbiak and you know, you could even say um, somebody like, you know, Rajo Nesterovich. He his stats look pretty similar actually, but his field goal percentage is down a bit. Also, um, I don't know. They just have way too many role players on this particular team. Going into the next year, basically the same core except they've added in Chauncey Billups. Relatively similar record. A big difference here is the defense got a lot worse, and um, there's not well, I guess a lot worse is pretty harsh. 4 spots worse. But again, pretty similar story, pretty similar record. The difference being that Chauncey Billups was a combo guard for them at this point as well. They got to the playoffs and played San Antonio, who really again was just a deeper team. They had David Robinson, they had Tim Duncan. I don't believe they actually had Tony Parker or Manu yet, but they had Steven Jackson, I think, at this point, and basically it just was Garnett and Duncan canceling each other out, and then you had David Robinson, who was better than anybody else the Wolves had at this point. Um, Terrell Brandon played fine in the playoffs. Wally Zerbiak played fine. But again, just those guys aren't really even all-star caliber, so it's kind of just like bringing a knife to a gunfight was what the Wolves were dealing with here. Is that they had Garnett, but again, really nobody outside of him, and they lacked a really good, consistent second option on this team. 2001 to 02, this was the season where Chauncey Billups really started to shine on this team. Terrell Brandon, as you'll see on the left side, only played 32 games, so Chauncey Billups got to step up, played a lot more minutes than the year before, got a lot more opportunities to start and get some more shot attempts and be a bigger part of the offense. And you'll see Wally Zerbiak actually had his best season on the Wolves as well, averaging about 19 points and 5 rebounds. Um, and this is actually one of the more balanced scoring years on this team with 5 different guys in double digits. And you'll notice Rasho Nesterovic again actually having a pretty good season efficiency wise for I believe he's a power forward. Um, about 50% from the field and 8.7 rebounds a game. But again, if you're relying on a guy like that to start for your team, you're just in a bad spot in the first place. He should be like your 10th man, not like a starting caliber player. Um, Outside of that, the Terrell Brandon injury, although it gave Billups a chance to succeed more, it did hurt them in that you could argue going into the season, their second best player missed 50 games. In the playoffs, Garnett actually plays out of his mind. You'll see his stats: 24 points, 19 rebounds, which is amazing. His efficiency was kind of bad, though, if you look, only less than 43% from the field. Chauncey played well. Zerbiak played well, but then again, no Terrell Brandon, who was really essentially their second best player. So not having him really hurt. Rasho Nesterovic actually, his stats got a little bit of a bump in improvement here, but overall, the team just, again, similar story over and over, bringing a knife to a gunfight, and Billups showed a lot of promise in these playoffs, though, and if they would have kept him, they would have been looking really good, and they could have built up a core with a backcourt of Brandon and Billups and a wing of Zerbiak, and then some big men of maybe like Kevin Garnett and Joe Smith. That would have been a really solid core moving forward. But we get into 02 to 03. They let Billups walk in free agency. I believe also at this point they traded Terrell Brandon for Troy Hudson, who was a bit younger, and they thought it would help the team a bit more. And the fact of the matter is, Troy Hudson was never that good of a player, but they were basically expecting him to be like the second best player on this team. Again, you have good seasons from Garnett and Zerbiak, and Troy Hudson is, I guess, the third wheel. Again, Rasho Nesterovic is playing 30 minutes a game and scoring 11 points. But let me reiterate, there is no scenario where Nesterovic should be really starting on a 51-win team, and it's pretty staggering that he actually is. Besides that, you've kind of got the similar cast of supporting guys with Peeler, Joe Smith, and then they brought in veterans like Kendall Gill and Rod Strickland, who really overall didn't have a huge impact. But you get to the playoffs, and a big thing I noticed was actually at the bottom, Joe Smith barely played, and this was a guy who they had done a lot to bring in. If you don't know the story, to sign Joe Smith, they did it in an underhanded way where he signed for the minimum, and they told him like down the road we'll give you a huge payday later off the books, and the NBA caught wind of this, so this was against the rules, and they revoked 3 first-round picks from the Timberwolves, which really hurt them. And just considering all that, the Wolves basically traded 3 first-rounders for Joe Smith, and to see that he's playing 8 minutes in their playoff runs is pretty disappointing. Outside of that, again, Garnett played well. Zerbiak played decent. Troy Hudson played okay. But you basically had Garnett and Shaq canceling each other out in this playoff series, and then you had Kobe matching up with like Zerbiak, and of course um, you're gonna have Kobe outdoing Zerbiak, and so that's really just the big difference here again is that Garnett just really didn't have a suitable second option on this team. Going forward to the next year, the Timberwolves finally made some good moves. They finally brought in some key help. They've brought in four-time All-Star Latrell Sprewell to help Garnett in free agency, and then they also traded for Sam Cassell, and I'm trying to remember who they traded for him. I believe, oh yeah, it was Joe Smith. They traded the terrible contract, or I guess it wasn't a terrible contract, but the terrible value of Joe Smith. They traded for Sam Cassell, which was a swindle. Sam Cassell puts up his best season as a pro, 20 points a game, 7 assists, nearly 50% from the field, and 40% from three. He's an all-star along with Garnett. Latrell Sprewell plays like a borderline all-star and gives them the wing shot creator that they've been begging for this whole Garnett run. They lead the West in wins. They're second in the NBA in record overall. They're the first seed. These represent this season is the only time the Timberwolves have won in the playoffs. They won the first two rounds, and then they lost in 6 games to the Lakers. If you look at how they lost, Sam Cassell actually missed half of the Western Conference Finals and was injured for all of it, so he didn't really play up to his standards. And as you'll see, he on the right-hand side, he missed the final 2 games of the series. Overall, everybody played well, but again, it's just a matter of like Garnett wasn't as good as Shaq, and Sprewell wasn't as good as Kobe, so you're gonna falter. And Sam Cassell was dealing with injuries like the whole series, so it's interesting to think about what this team could have been if they would have had the proper health and all that. But it's it's a it's a something that you can't really go back and think about too much because history is the way it is. But again, a great offense, great defense. And Trenton Hassel, who doesn't have really impressive stats, was a really good wing defender for this team. And they didn't really have much depth still, and that was the thing that hurt them in the playoffs when Cassell went out. Was that it really was again just Garnett, Sprewell, and Zerbiak, and Zerbiak was getting older at the time. So again, they didn't really have much offensive depth whatsoever after Cassell went out. 04 to 05, basically the same team, but the difference is here that um, they just didn't really have as much shine as the year before. You had Sam Cassell miss 23 games. Um, Sprewell played okay, but he was definitely declining, and I believe he was around like 34 at this time, and he was definitely showing his age a bit more. Same thing with Zerbiak. Actually played a pretty good season, but again, getting a bit older. Outside of that, you look at why this team faltered. The West got a lot better this year, and that the Suns emerged as a huge contender. The Mavericks had a resurgent season where they went from 54 wins to, I believe, 60 or 62. Um, Outside of that, you had the Spurs put up like a 60-win season, I believe. The Clippers were improving at this point too. And you basically had everybody in the West get better, and the Timberwolves just stayed the same. And they experienced some injury issues with their second best player. So they did not make the playoffs. You'll see Sam Cassell's numbers overall dipped a bit, especially his 3-point percentage and his scoring output. And yeah, they just struggled. Getting into 05 to 06, this is really the end of the line for the team. At this point, they had traded Sam Cassell for the guy in the bottom left, who's Marko Jaric, who is by all means a terrible NBA player. And they just figured that Sam Cassell was so old and declining and injury riddled that they should trade him. But Sam Cassell goes on to have one of his best seasons, a triumphant comeback season with the Clippers. Plays like a borderline all-star, helps them get to Game 7 of the second round. By all means, a bad trade by the Timberwolves. And then you had Latrell Sprewell turn down a contract extension and retire, and the Wolves bring in Ricky Davis to replace him, who's top right. And Ricky Davis is basically a volume scorer who's very inefficient and honestly not that good. And he misses most of the season, over half of it. Wally Zerbiak misses half of the season. Um, yeah, so why did the Wolves fail this year? Basically, they traded away their second best player. Their third best player retired, and to replace them, they brought in a volume scorer who's super inefficient, and then basically like an eighth or ninth man in Marko Jaric, who really there was no point in trading for this dude, and he was not very good. You can see he actually shot under 40% from the field, which is terrible. Um, yeah, and at this point, you were basically just relying on Zerbiak to hopefully be the second option, who actually has a great season here, but um, I believe he was injured, and they also did trade him away partway through the season too at the deadline, I believe. So, um, yeah, Trenton Hassel, you could argue, is the second best player on this team, and he was a very, very mediocre offensive player. Good defensively, but mediocre offensively. And soon after, the Timberwolves traded away Garnett, and that was history. So, if I had to sum up why the Wolves struggled as a team overall, it was because they made a lot of really bad front office moves. They never really made the right decisions to get help for Garnett. They way overpaid for Joe Smith in the long run, which hampered them in the future. And they basically just settled for the bare minimum as far as surrounding Garnett with talent, and so they never got over the hump. And when they did get the proper talent, they really only had them all for 1 year because they were all like mid 30s at that point, between Cassell and Sprewell, and I believe Garnett was like 29 at that point. So there you have, guys. That's the history of why the Timberwolves rose and fell, and I hope you enjoyed the video. Continue to check out the series if you're interested, and I will see you next time. Bye.